2019 Toyota Camry. First, 21 millimeter to get off the wheel. Make sure you got it supported good. I got my brakes here. Got a 14 millimeter wrench and a 17 millimeter wrench. That's for the bracket bolts and the caliper bolts. Kind of skipping ahead here, but I am going to show you if your rotor is rusted onto the hub, this little spot with threads, you could run a bolt through those threads and it'll push the rotor off the hub. Here's a bolt size if you want to go get this prior to doing the brake job. More about that in a minute, but first let's get our caliper bolts off. 14 millimeter. So on the Toyotas, sometimes these caliper bolts will just spin and they won't break loose, and you can see it spinning because you'll see this this part on the other side of the caliper will just spin. Let me show you. You see how that nut is just spinning with the bolt? So what you want to do is you want to hold that nut with some pliers or a wrench. I just use pliers most of the time, and then you could use your ratchet to break the bolt loose, and then you could get it out. Okay, there's my caliper bolt. I'm gonna do the same for the bottom. Get it out, save the bolts, we're gonna need them. Alright, so I got both my caliper bolts. Go and wiggle this off gently. Careful not to smash your fingers. Now what you want to do is gently set this over the steering knuckle, and you could kind of rest it on the heat shield. You want to support this brake line. You don't want it hanging down or being stressed out at all. So you can get our pads out. These are factory Toyota pads. You could tell by the little squealers and the shims on them. More about that in a couple minutes. Go ahead and get these out. Again, these are Toyota pads, so I'm going to replace them with Toyota OEM pads, and I'm going to switch the shims over as well as the squealer. So go ahead and get that out. Now, once you have the pads out, if you're taking the caliper bracket off, it's a 17 millimeter. If you're just doing a pad slap, you don't need to take this off, but I'm replacing my rotors, so I'm going to go ahead and take these off. These are going to be tighter than the caliper bolts, so we'll just break these free and get them out. If you're taking your rotors to a machine shop to get machined, that you'd need to take this off. All right, go ahead and get these out. All right, slide the caliper bracket off. Be careful not to drop it or hit your toes or nothing. Mine was just loose and it wiggled off, but say your rotor was like rusted to the hub or like not wanting to come off. Like I said before, there are these threads, and you could just use this bolt and run it through the threads, and it'll push the rotor off the hub. And it has two spots for the threads, so you can kind of work it back and forth between the two holes if you need to. Shouldn't give you that much trouble though, to be honest, but you know, just something in case you're on like the East Coast or something. Little tip. All right, so here's my factory rotor. This is my part number. This is from Toyota, and then I got factory pads. I recommend going factory if you can. You know, if you can't, you know, I get it. But I always try to go factory. Alright, so I got my rotor. My rotor came wrapped up, but sometimes they have like weird glue on them or like packaging adhesive or something. So I just always kind of wipe these off with brake cleaner and just to make sure they're good. Now the back of this had some like rust looking spots. It's not, I don't think it's actual rust. I don't know what it is, but I've seen this before on rotors, and as long as you wipe it off with a rag as best you can, you should be fine. No need to panic or nothing if it don't look perfectly silver. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this on. Now, since this is a new rotor, I don't really need to put it, you know, back how it was. If this was the original, I'll try to put it back on the same hole that it came off of. I like to match these up. When you get them out, just put it against your old rotor and just make sure that the dimensions are the same, like the circumference of the rotor. You know, just if you just want to double check before you go put everything together. So we got that good. Now let's go to my caliper bracket. Now the caliper bracket, I recommend taking a brush and cleaning out those little hardware slides. Just dust gets in there sometimes, and it can just kind of, you know, be dirty and make noise over time. So I brush those out. Now the caliper pins, you can pull these out. The bottom one, it will have a black little rubber washer on it, or O-ring. I put a little lube in here, and then I just put this back in. You don't need to do a ton of lube because then your pin won't go back in. This one doesn't have a black rubber gasket on the end of it. That's the top one. And then these should just be able to kind of move back and forth. So sometimes these get rusted in there and they get frozen. You have to get them out. You have to make sure they can move. They don't move like super easy and freely, but just make sure they can kind of slide back and forth. All right, so we'll get our caliper bracket back on with the 17mm bolts. Tighten that down. I'm gonna put the torque specs in the description. So go ahead and get these tight. Okay, so I got those good. Now, as far as the pads go, we need to switch over the shims to the new pads. These are Toyota shims. Don't throw these away. If you got aftermarket pads, just keep the shims and the squealer, because in the future, if you go to OEM, you're going to need them. Now, here's what an OEM Toyota pad looks like. It doesn't have shims or squealers, so we need to switch those over. The Toyota pads come with a little black grease that you use to apply it. And then, yeah, there's the squealers. Those prevent it from shifting when you're in reverse, the pads from shifting and clicking. So we're going to put a little of this black grease on here. Now, this grease is for heat, but in a way, it kind of acts as like a semi-glue. That's not what it's made to do. It's not made to be a glue, but it'll help hold these shims in place and not move on you or fall off. The shims should be able to stay on by themselves with their little fingers. They should have enough tension. You could kind of gently bend the tabs with needle nose pliers if you need to make them tight. But yeah, this grease stuff goes on here. I believe it's for heat dissipation, and also it will help these things not move as much, keep them in place. It's good for when you're putting the pads back in. Just make sure the holes line up. There's ridges in the pads for the fingers to go, so make sure those are in and good, and just make sure those shims are on good. Put the squealer on. It goes like this. This thing goes on the top of the pad, because like I said, when you go in reverse, the pad is going to want to shift upwards, and that squealer acts as a squealer but also as a spring to make it so the pad doesn't shift, making that clicking noise when you're in reverse. So also lube the ends of this a little bit, just a little bit. You don't need to go crazy. Like, I put some lube. That's actually more than I usually put. But yeah, that's lubed up. Now, if you have aftermarket pads and they have shims on them already, then you could just disregard this part about the shims. Aftermarket pads sometimes come assembled with everything you need. All right, so I got that on there. Same procedure for the inner pad. Go ahead and get this on. Got my sensor on the top. And put my my brake pad in here. Sometimes they can be kind of a pain to get in, but mine actually went in just fine. So that's it. Now we're going to compress this piston caliper. You need a piston caliper tool like this, or if you have like giant channel locks, you could kind of squeeze the caliper piston back in place from the back of the caliper. There's many ways to do it. If you don't have a tool, just Google it, and I'm sure there's a ton of inventive ways to push this caliper piston in the caliper. So we got that in. Be careful for these boots. Sometimes they like to pop out like that. You could just kind of like massage it a little bit, and it'll pop back into the place it needs to be. All right, so make sure your brake line is how it was when you first started doing the brakes. I got this on. These pins sometimes like to stick out. You might have to move the pins a little bit. Like I said, make sure your brake line is good. Some people twist the brake line and then they put the caliper back on, and it causes brake pulling, so careful not to do that. I got my caliper bolts in like that. I'm going to hand thread them, and then I'm going to tighten these down. And like I said, watch out for that nut, because it'll spin on you and your caliper bolts won't get tight. So make sure you hold that and tighten this down if you need to. Again, I'll put torque specs in the description soon. So we'll get that in, and that should be it. Just do the same for both sides. Thanks.
Pretty good.